Hello, and welcome to episode number 67 of the Point of Convergence podcast. As always, I am your host, ExoAcademian. When we think back to the dawn of the modern UFO era in the 1940s, and the subsequent reports of sightings and interactions ever since, whether they be of the quintessential flying saucers, black triangles, tic-tacs, or orbs, the focus has largely been on how these strange and sophisticated craft and/or phenomena seem to suddenly appear in our skies. Where are they coming from? Who are they? What is their agenda? All of these questions inevitably arise as we perceive them entering our reality. It goes without saying that it is these others, whoever and whatever they may ultimately prove to be, whether extraterrestrial, interdimensional, time-traveling humans, ultraterrestrials, or all of the above. It is they who have been in charge of the interaction with us. And it is this revelation that has set many a human being on edge. Why is this off-putting for some? Well, because we humans like to believe we're in control of our daily lives. Of course, this fragile sense of control is only further perturbed when we learn of so-called abductions, where these others, or at least a subset of them, reportedly take human beings from the comfort of their own homes and up into their craft and elsewhere. While what I just outlined describes the typical narrative around UFOs and aliens and our interaction with them, it is not the full story. For decades now, there have existed groups of curious and bold people who have sought to take the front foot, as it were, in regards to the encounters with these apparently non-human intelligences. These groups have sought to define a series of protocols around which contact and ongoing communication with these, for lack of a better term, aliens, can take place. While these attempts at human-initiated contact may seem surprising to some, what is even more interesting is that the historical record has shown that these efforts have proven successful. Not always, but often enough so as to be considered effective. Of course, what this also suggests is that there really is an opportunity for a relationship here, a two-way dialogue, so to speak, human to other and vice versa. But what are the nature of these protocols, and what makes them quote-unquote work? And who really are we contacting when these efforts do prove successful? Are we being deceived, perhaps even used? Are we opening ourselves up to manipulation? Or are these interactions exactly what they often appear to be, peaceful and cooperative? Are these others our moral superiors? Or are they just technological giants with no qualms about using less advanced species? These have always been and will continue to be the pressing and pertinent questions in play when it comes to human contact with alien others. Speaking of these matters, I personally had an opportunity recently to engage these very questions in a very direct, up-close, and personal manner when I joined a special group of experiencers and researchers to both pursue contact and explore consciousness as part of a multi-day retreat. It is the nature of the experiences we had, as well as the lessons learned as a result, that are the topic of this, the 67th episode of the Point of Convergence podcast. As we begin this week's episode, let me just take a few minutes to set the scene as I describe how I became involved with this group to begin with. First of all, I should point out that I've been investigating the UFO phenomenon and general paranormality within the larger context of consciousness, really, for years now, and officially as part of this podcast, Point of Convergence, for about a year and a half now. It was December of 2020 that I first began this podcast. And for the first year or so, I really was just looking at the different hypotheses, the different notions that were arising and have arisen historically to make sense of the phenomena we are experiencing and seeing. And I was taking you along with me on the journey as we discussed the pros and cons of these different elements of these different hypotheses, and as we tried to see which of them, either individually or in combination, could make sense of all of the data we are seeing. And over time, I think it's probably become pretty clear, as I've showed my hand, so to speak, that I lean towards a combination of these hypotheses being in play in terms of explaining the totality of what we're seeing. I think we're seeing a complex array of different phenomena that we tend to group together only because they're equally strange in many ways. But just because they're equally strange doesn't mean they're one thing, one entity, one phenomenon. I would suggest it is our bias in paying so much attention to the strangeness, the absurdity even, that Jacques Vallée identified, that tends to make us draw the conclusion, even unconsciously, that this is one thing. That because it's so strange, it is an outlier from the rest of reality and should be thought of as one thing. I don't think that's the best explanation of the data. Even amidst the high strangeness we see across a variety of phenomena, I think distinct patterns have emerged over time when you pay close attention. At least that's my working hypothesis, and that's what I've been investigating as I've looked into different cases and different groups of cases that fall under a certain kind of pattern structure. So all that is to say, that little preamble there was just to describe what this podcast has been about, what my journey has been about. I've had several listeners write in to say that they enjoy this podcast partly because it feels like they're along for the ride as I myself explore this phenomenon more deeply and take different twists and turns as the data becomes more and more clear. Or to be more precise, as certain patterns seem to emerge from within the totality of the data. Now, of course, much of this analysis has happened at a 30,000-foot view, so to speak. In other words, my personality is such that I like to step back, take the broad perspective as much as I can, see the totality, see the lay of the land, so to speak, and look for patterns within that. And as part of that process, I familiarize myself with the data, with the raw data as much as I can. In other words, the literature around experiencer accounts and whatnot, and witness accounts. And I try to separate that from the interpretations around those events so that I can get a good sense of the overall data first and foremost. And only then do I then look into different hypotheses to make sense of that data, at least potentially. So that's the 30,000-foot view. That's been my general approach, and I think I would recommend it to anyone. That said, there's only so much you can learn by looking from that 30,000-foot view perspective. There's another kind of data set you can bring into the picture when you personally experience this phenomenon, because as we know, the impact on individuals themselves is one of the most interesting and significant data points. And it's one thing to read accounts of people's experience with the phenomenon. It's something else entirely to have your own experience with it and then to draw conclusions based on how it's changing you, if at all. And of course, here self-awareness really matters. Knowing yourself really matters. The more you are self-aware, the more you're able to distinguish differences, potentially, that emerge in you as a result of interacting with the phenomenon. Now, as many of you probably are already aware, I have had my own personal experiences with the phenomenon that just happened to me. The first one that I remember clearly anyway happened in 2005 in a hotel, and there's an episode where I discuss that in some detail, so I won't go back over it again now. But I have had experiences before. But of course, those were not by my initiative. They just happened to me, as is often the case for people who experience the phenomenon. But of course, there are different kinds of experiences where humans are actually the ones taking the front foot, as I mentioned in the introduction, where human beings are proactive in trying to contact these others. Again, just as a quick disclaimer here, when I say others, my contention is that there are probably multiple others, multiple groups of others arising from different sources, different origins. I just want to make that clear so you don't assume that when I say make contact with these others, that I mean they're all one thing. And then once you've done one, you've covered it all. I don't think that's the case, not likely. But nevertheless, there are people who have engaged in trying to contact and interact with groups of these others. And that's what I was interested in doing as well. In other words, in addition to taking the 30,000-foot view and looking at the data of other people's experiences, and in addition to reflecting on my own personal experiences that just happened to me, so to speak, I was also open to having my own encounters where I am the one taking the initiative. And I was even more interested in the notion of doing this as part of a group of people because I think the amplitude, so to speak, goes up even more when you can do that, especially when you're joining forces with what Joseph Burks would call prime contactees. That is people who've had often lifelong encounters with this phenomenon, and who seem to demonstrate a certain kind of repeatability with their encounters. In other words, they don't just have these few and far in between, but they can happen quite regularly. And recently, a few months ago, the opportunity arose that fit this description exactly. I was invited to be part of a group of people that were going to do a retreat over several days in a very unique location as part of an endeavor to make contact, to try to make contact with some of these others, as well as explore consciousness. So when this opportunity arose, I jumped at it because it really was a very unique opportunity with a very, very promising group of people. And speaking of who was involved, it's important to stop and make this point here too. Just as your chances of making contact go up when you're associated with people who would be considered prime contactees, according to Joseph Burke's definition, by the same token, if you're joined by the wrong group of people that are too cynical or too skeptical or just carry too much negative energy, that can actually decrease the likelihood of an interaction. That was my sense of this, my felt sense, and it also is backed up by the data itself. That is to say, when you look at experiencer accounts, this seems to be backed up in the data. So again, just to make that point crystal clear, if you join forces with people who have had repeated encounters with these others, your chances of making contact along with them go up. But likewise, if you associate with the wrong group of people who are too cynical, skeptical, or just bring too much negative energy or even too much vain energy, it seems to just diminish the signal altogether and no contact happens. This has been demonstrated in the historical data, even in contact attempts that were made in South America, for instance, decades ago. Now, as I already mentioned, there are likely different types of entities, different kinds of intelligences arising from very different origin sources. At least that's my working hypothesis. Also, there are different means of contact. They're not all the same, and some may target one group over another, even without us being aware that we're targeting one group over another with a certain protocol rather than another. The protocol I was interested in pursuing was what is often referred to as CE5, which is short for Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, of course. Now, the second I bring up that term, CE5, some people are going to be put off because they immediately think of Stephen Greer. Now, as I've said many times before, I'm thankful for the contributions that Stephen Greer has made, especially historically. He helped to bring this notion that we can contact these others, that we can initiate a kind of relational dynamic. It wasn't necessarily pioneered by him, but it was certainly popularized by him, especially in North America. Now, I think whenever we broach this topic of CE5, we also need to acknowledge that while Stephen Greer made some great historical contributions to this field, he also more recently has brought some shade on the entire community and the entire endeavor of CE5, or that is, the attempt to make contact with these others by way of human initiative, because he's not only employed some techniques that some people would question in terms of their validity and their honesty, their sincerity, but because he's also monetized this to such a degree that to many it just seems like a swindler's kind of way of gathering riches. That might seem harsh, but when you look at the situation over the last decade or so, that seems to be what's going on. Those are fair critiques, I think. But again, we have to separate the techniques, the protocols of CE5 from a person like Stephen Greer, even if he was the one that popularized them within our culture. So let's make that clear from the outset. CE5 does not equal Stephen Greer. Stephen Greer does not equal CE5. We need to look at these protocols and the results of employing them at face value. We need to look at what it produces in terms of data and not get distracted by personalities and cult of personalities that may have been historically associated with the protocols. I should also add that, as I already alluded to, this retreat that took place over several days and several nights at a rather well-known location didn't only involve testing out the CE5 protocols. We did do that on each of the nights we were there. But there were other consciousness experiments we were interested in, including remote viewing, telepathy, astral projection, and the like. We tried all of these things with rather impressive sensor systems as well, so we could really try to get robust data to later examine. Now, as I already mentioned, you're much more likely to have a positive encounter with these others if you're joined by people who already seem to have a capacity to make contact. That isn't to say you can't make contact on your own. I know people who've done that many, many times. However, as Joseph Burks would argue, and I think compellingly so, when you join forces with prime contactees who seem to have been selected by these others for some reason or another that perhaps is beyond us, the chances of making connection and contact go up all the more. So, I will say that without naming names, because I don't want to do that, we had several what I would consider prime contactees along with us. One from here in the United States, who has become a good friend of mine, by the way, and it's this person that I'm also involved in a separate project with, which I'll have more to say about later this year. So that person was involved, as well as some people from South America and elsewhere. Now, before I get to the first night and our first interaction, let me first say that for those who are not familiar, CE5, which again is Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, also referred to as HICE, and this is a term that Joseph Burks coined, which stands for Human-Initiated Contact Events, is all about human beings proactively aiming to make contact with these others through intentionality, focused intentionality, a high degree of consciousness, positivity, etc. Those of you who've listened to this podcast for any duration of time know I've frequently mentioned that the intentionality, the energy, the level of consciousness we bring to these kinds of encounters is essential because, as been noted by me as well as many others, we are often given a reflection of what we put out. In other words, the energy we carry gets reflected back to us. And I'm not saying that's a simple one-for-one equation. We get back more than just what we put out, but I am saying that the end result can be, and often is, impacted by the energy we bring. So it's important that we're aware of that. I would also add that it's not as simple as simply adopting the right energy signature on the day of the event. While that does matter, we do need to be aware of what we're bringing on the day of the event. It has more to do with who we are as a person altogether. Our level of consciousness, our priorities, our spiritual clarity, those kind of things. So it's much more than just a simple equation on the day of. I want to make that clear. But that said, when it does come to the day of the event, as in the case with those of us involved in this event, we took the time to meditate beforehand, both as a group and as individuals. In our particular case, what we actually did was we came together first as a group and discussed what we were going to attempt, and then we went into our separate chambers and actually used meditation and a kind of astral projection protocol to really focus our intention as a group, as a collective. And we did this prior to going outside to actually skywatch, as it were, and to see if we could make contact with these others. Okay, so after we had all done that individual and collective preparation, we went out into the central meadow where we would have a really expansive view of the night sky while we tried to make contact. And by the way, I would add that this happened when we had really great weather, so we were really lucky in that sense, because it actually had been pouring with rain in that area in the days previous to this event. But during the retreat, we had clear skies pretty much throughout. So as we gathered in this sort of semicircular kind of formation in this central meadow, I wasn't sure exactly what to expect. I will admit to you that I thought if something's going to happen, it's going to happen later in the evening. Now, we got out there, I think, around 9 p.m. And when did we have our first contact? It actually happened about 30 minutes later, just after 9:30 p.m. Suddenly, to my surprise, and believe me, I was surprised because I wasn't really expecting it that quickly, a large yellow orb manifested in front of us in the sky just above the mountain that was, I believe, to the west of us. And just to clarify, when I say manifested, what I mean is I didn't see it track across the sky from behind the horizon and then come in our direction. I just saw it manifest in front of us. Now, perhaps there was a track before that, but I didn't see it. What I saw was this yellow orb suddenly manifest in front of us. People shouted out, 12 o'clock, because that's what we had already designated as this way of communicating to each other where in the sky certain objects or phenomena were manifesting. So even those of us who didn't see it right away, and I did see it right away, but even for those that didn't, once we had shouted out 12 o'clock, Everyone knew in which direction to look, and then everyone saw it. We all saw it. And this was a fairly large group. Almost 20 people or so were there to witness this. And again, just for the sake of clarity, for those of you who are not familiar with this term orb, what I basically mean is a ball of light, a yellow ball of light. That's what we saw. It didn't look like a physical object in terms of being made of metal or plastic or something that you could knock your finger against and get a pinging sound. It looked like a ball of energy or a ball of light that manifested before us. So right away, for me, that was deeply impacting. I had now beheld this large orb and had done so while having numerous other witnesses that were there alongside me. But I should add that, as I already alluded to, we had numerous other sensor systems on hand to track all of these events. We had sophisticated cameras, video cameras. We had radar equipment. In addition, we had a random number generator that was stationed on the side of one of the mountains in our location. And the idea here, for those of you who are not familiar, is that random number generators just basically pump out numbers in a random fashion. So you shouldn't see any particular pattern emerge because it should be random. But what we have found, what various consciousness studies have found, well beyond just the UFO phenomenon, but even investigating psi phenomena, what has been found is that human intentionality itself, consciousness itself, seems to be able to affect random number generators so as to make them go non-random, so to speak. And what we mean by that is a distinct pattern does emerge that's not random. It doesn't look anything like random. When that happens, it seems to be indicating that consciousness itself in some way is impacting our physical reality. And this is being reflected in a random number generator that is basically a computer program that, again, according to the physicalist model, according to the notions found in reductionistic materialism, should not be possible. There should be no way that consciousness of any kind should impact physical reality like this, and yet that's exactly what often happens. So that's what's been shown to be the case historically, that consciousness does indeed seem to be able to impact these machines, these sensors that should be impervious to this kind of influence. So then, of course, the question is, what happened with us? Did our encounter and our shared intentionality make any difference? Well, as it turns out, yes, it did. And let me break down how this was the case. First of all, as one of the technicians later showed us when he showed us the actual graph of this random number generator, what you first saw was that it went non-random when we got together with a shared intentionality. In other words, when we had a moment of intense focus, shared meditative intention, then you would see this reflected in the output of the random number generator. And that was the first kind of impact that was visible when you looked at the actual graph that was produced. The second kind was when the actual phenomena showed up. So when that orb showed up, to the very moment the random number generator really did go crazy, so to speak. It went non-random to the tune of 2 deviations, which is highly significant if you know your statistics from psychology and whatnot. This was a highly statistically significant result that happened at the very moment we observed this orb in the sky. What we're saying here is that we have a second sensor system validating that it wasn't just in our consciousness, or if it was just in our consciousness, it was also happening within the wiring of this random number generator computer system program. So that's highly impacting, highly relevant, and I wanted to bring that to your attention. If nothing else, it certainly seems to exclude the possibility of a shared delusion or a shared hallucination, because if that's what we experienced, why was this random number generator, this computer program, impacted in a similar manner at the very same time, at the very same location? So that's what happened on night number 1, very impacting for all of us. The next day, the technician came to us and showed us this output from the random number generator, and that's when we became aware of this second data point that corroborated the first one, which was, of course, our experience in real time. But again, we had multiple nights. So the next night, we also set up with the same sort of protocols, although we tweaked things a little bit because, again, this was an ongoing experiment. So we tried a few different things. We tried a different kind of preparation, organized the group slightly differently. We tried to go in with even more shared focus this next time. Now, from this point on, I'm going to give you just the highlights of what happened over the next several nights, rather than going into so much detail. But I will say that on the second night, we also had a positive experience. In other words, we did see phenomena in the sky, although this time it happened much later in the evening. What's also important to note here is that it was specifically when a couple of the people from South America really had an intense focus and were actually sending their intention to one particular point in the sky that we had something manifest in the sky. We had phenomena manifest in that very part of the sky at that very moment, which again just highlights the degree to which our consciousness, our intentionality plays such a central role in what ends up happening. Now here I'd like to pause for a moment, especially for the sake of those of you who are more skeptical about this entire kind of event, to make the point that not only did we have multiple sensor systems on hand to try to validate and corroborate these experiences, but on top of that, we had people involved who were trained in examining these kinds of events. In other words, people who had logged hundreds or thousands of hours looking at the sky at night, filming it, using radar and whatnot, and becoming highly, highly familiar with every object that's up in the sky. Anything that's prosaic, in other words, satellites, meteors, planets, stars, planes, the International Space Station. When that would go over, we would call out to each other. We're tracking that, that's the ISS, at 3 o'clock or what have you. So I make this point to those of you who might wonder if this is just a case of confirmation bias, that we're looking in one part of the sky and eventually we see something and misidentify it as something anomalous. What I'm saying is we went in with a clear intention to be aware of anything that's prosaic or conventional and look specifically with an expert's eye to see things that really did stand out as anomalous, and indeed that did happen on each of the nights that we were gathered together. Now, with that said, I will also make the point that a key lesson that emerged from this entire retreat involved our intentionality, but specifically it also involved us being aware that having an open mind and an open heart was essential in the process. And that is to say, even when something was coming over that initially could be identified as a satellite, we wouldn't shout it out as being such. At least we learned not to. At first we did. But eventually, one of the key experiencers, one of the prime contactees that I identified earlier, made the point that it's important to not prematurely make that assumption that it's something conventional, because when you do that, you close off the possibilities, you close off the consciousness connection that can be made with whatever is up there. And whatever we're contacting in CE5 seems to have a spiritual element, an energetic element connected to our consciousness. So if we go in with too much skepticism, too much of a scientific mindset, where we're quick to say that's a satellite for sure, before we know it is, we can actually end up severing the connection with something that's not actually a satellite, but is just tracking like a satellite initially, and thus rob ourselves of a potentially amazing experience. And to make that point, to really underline it, I will say that several of the people involved with this event talked about exactly that kind of occurrence, where on previous occasions they saw something coming across the sky that looked like it was following the trajectory of a traditional satellite, looked to be about the right size as a satellite, the right elevation, etc. But then this object would suddenly stop or make a 90-degree turn or shoot straight up into space. And then it became clear, abundantly clear, that it was not a satellite. And one of the key lessons we learned was that it's important to not prematurely identify something as conventional, because in doing so, you may sever the very consciousness connection that is connecting to something non-prosaic that is about to show you something truly stupendous that will identify it as something anomalous. So thus far, I've identified two different occasions, two different nights where something showed up. And by the way, the second night was a different kind of phenomena than the first. The second night was more like flashes that appeared in that one particular part of the sky where these two people were focusing their attention. Now, I'd like to share one more event that happened on a different night again. And on this third night, what ended up happening was that several of the members of the group were having a bit of a disagreement, an agreeable disagreement, but a disagreement around how we should refer to these events and these objects or phenomena as we notice them in the sky. Now again, here I want to highlight that things never got too heated, but there was a disagreement happening. And I think some of us in the group recognized that this was perhaps putting a bit of a damper, a cooling effect on what might occur in the sky. Because by this point, we were clearly all aware that our shared intention, our collective consciousness, was a key element in the entire endeavor. Now, to be clear, on this particular night, we hadn't noticed anything that seemed anomalous in the skies above our heads. Now, these three people kept talking, kept dialoguing about what was the right way to proceed. And then some people actually ended up going off to bed because it was getting later in the evening. It was after midnight at this point. But these three people, to their credit, kept dialoguing, and eventually they came to a shared understanding and surrendered their egos and all got together and had a group hug and asked each other for forgiveness, and in the process turned it into a teachable moment where they all learned something in the process. And what's truly fascinating and revealing, ultimately, is that it was at that very, very moment that, again, phenomena manifested in the sky. Orbs above the location where they were actually dialoguing appeared at just that moment. And once again, just as on the previous nights, the random number generator showed this in the output at the very moment that they came together in this point of shared connection and mutual admiration and love for each other. That strong conscious intention broadcast something that produced an effect where these orbs showed up at that very moment when they hadn't during all of the hours previous to that moment. So again, a very, very impacting and revelatory moment for everyone involved. So there you have it. I've shared 3 different nights and 3 different experiences we all had, and the lessons in consciousness we all learned as a result of our shared intention. Now, this was a wonderful retreat. I hope we do it again a year from now or at some other point in the future. It was an experience I will personally never forget, not just because of the lessons learned, but because of the shared bonds we formed as a group, where again, consciousness was fundamental to the entire endeavor. We all feel like we've been infected, so to speak, not just by these others that intermingled with us, but also with each other's consciousness. We are somehow part of something larger than ourselves as a result of this retreat. Now, because this retreat lasted for several days and several nights, there's much I have not been able to share yet, and I will no doubt refer to this event in future podcast episodes, but I at least wanted to do this initial one where I gave a bit of a debrief on some of the key elements that were discovered as a result of our shared consciousness and contact experiment. To be honest, the entire experience was so profound, so deeply moving, that I'm still personally processing much of what happened, and I've heard the very same thing from the others that were involved as well. And on that note, we've come to the close of another edition of the Point of Convergence podcast. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian. But until next time, friends, from deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, this is ExoAcademian signing out.